Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everegg's Global Insights team. And Steve, we missed last week. We had a bit of a disrupted time.
Yes, there was a cyclone looming. Cyclone is what we call hurricanes, and it's cyclone. A clockwise action, a very large storm, caught Joe in Melbourne as we were trying to set up for last week's video and just didn't work. Anyway, bit of stuck to cover. Some market updates. Talk about last night's Pulse result, which is quite interesting, and a bit of trade. And of course, chart of the week.
Of course.
So let's just catch up a little bit on last week's GDT result. We won't go through the full thing, but Skimmel powder stronger in the short term. Just two contracts really, C1, C2, where we saw between 3 and 4% growth lift in prices. New Zealand butter also up across all contracts pretty much, and that's some interesting background for this week's discussion. But also, what happened on the event was the premium for New Zealand Skimmel powder lifted again. It dipped a little in the previous event, but it's pushed well above $400 a tonne this time. That's New Zealand's price in excess of the European price, which is an average of Arla's contracts on this occasion. That's also given support for short-term Skimmel powder futures on SGX. See those first three contracts lifting over the past week, driven by that GDT result. But then came Pulse.
Yeah, and the Pulse medium heat C2 price for skim milk powder dropped 6.1% from the auction last week, Steve. It was up $15 a tonne from the prior Pulse, but it's going to be interesting when we get to next week. Can the main auction market hold up?
Yeah, is this a lead signal that we've got too far out of touch with other regions?
So the differential has certainly widened. As you said there, Steve, that we've got the GDT in the light blue really out of step with other regions now. Now that the CME futures for NDM or skim milk powder have really lined up with Europe. It's New Zealand that's way out of step for those early months, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then just looking at the EX skim milk powder futures, they weakened again last week on really soft demand, Steve. There's not a lot of supply news out, but demand's still pretty weak. And also in the US, it was weaker. Stocks for January were reported to be 41% higher year on year. And that's quite remarkable. Given that production hasn't increased, it really implies how weak ongoing demand in the US is, because there hasn't been a lot of export activity given how far out of whack non-fat dry milk prices had been over the last part of 2024. So, not long ago, we were talking about how the US price was way at a premium compared to the rest of the world. That's now flipped. The question is, will it be enough to bring Mexican buyers back into the action, particularly if they want to if they were getting ahead of whatever tariff action might be coming in the next couple of months. And then while we're on the Pulse, whole milk powder, a little less interesting, unchanged from the last GDT auction, and up 0.4% or $15 a tonne from the prior Pulse. So that just looks like a fairly steady line there, Steve, at the moment.
Yeah.
Bit of a holding pattern. In terms of the futures, SGX whole milk powder futures drifted a little bit weaker. Interestingly, if you go back, to the recent peak in early February that we saw in GDT, skim milk powder has only given up $140 a tonne, around or almost 5%, but whole milk powder C2 prices have actually dropped $300 a tonne, and that's 7%. So just interesting looking back to that peak, GDT-induced peak that we had a month ago, Steve.
Yeah. And over to Europe, and we'll spend a bit of time in the European context, but butter's given up a little bit in the past week. There's a lot of confusion. You can see how flat those curves are. Cream prices have rebounded. Look, the story about that has been well shared. It's been a short squeeze. Demand has been pretty good out of the consumer end. Retailers needed a restock. They dropped their shelf prices, had a rush of takers for reduced prices, and they had to restock. That's caught them a bit out on the hop. There's absolutely no carry in those forward contracts. Still a lot of uncertainty about whether milk production is going to be up through spring, and whether cheese demand holds up to impact availability of fat moving into those products. Interestingly, when you take this into the context for cheese, that US market's been reasonably fragile, weak demand side, new plants are filling with milk, and recent reports there are a lot of cows now heading to those production fields, so we should see a bit more production supported through into those new facilities. But there's also uncertainty with the tariff impacts, especially the Mexican impacts, if there is going to be a tariff and will there be retaliation. But here in this chart, we're showing the comparison between the US futures for cheddar, which tends to be the benchmark for mozzarella production, and prices in Europe. That dark line is a fair value assessment taken from our fundamentals analysis, but using forward prices on the futures market, but showing just where the GDT mozzarella price fell and where last week's spot value for mozzarella on EEX. So interesting, they have a very tight band there, but that's a healthy gap. The gap is over $600 a tonne in Q2, or 28 cents a pound in American speak. So one to watch as we go further. And just wrapping up on this, the butter futures obviously have pretty steep backwardation there in that forward curve, but GDT lifted this, and the expectation we're going to see continued tight supplies through that channel, with obviously a lot more AMF produced and a heavy discount on that side of it. EU production is an interesting little dynamic.
Yeah, just looking at the weekly data out of Germany and France, and the combined total is down 2.3% in the latest week. It's made to look a little bit better by last year's number, especially in France, but really it's a bit of a struggle in terms of EU production there, Steve.
Yeah. So what came out recently through Eurostat is the results of, they do 6 monthly cow surveys. Culling data comes out quite late, but this gives you a half-year glimpse at where the herd sizes are in each of the major producers. EU level down 3.4% year on year. Particularly bad in northwest regions. You see Germany, France, Netherlands, all impacted by, I think the Netherlands number is probably a surprise that it's only down 2%. We adjusted Poland, and the raw data came out with Poland being up
12% down.
12% down on prior year.
10% up.
10% up. So we've taken a 2-year average on the Polish number there, but still going into spring with a lot fewer cows. Let's talk about blue tongue. This is we could go across regions and look at this. There aren't many new cases being reported, Joe. It's still, quiet in winter. It's probably a couple of months before we see a real flare-up in numbers again. But this is the status at the end of January in France. A lot of the focus in France was on the top region, the northeast, which was the same strain as the cases in Netherlands and Belgium. But as you can see, this is stretched right across France. These are simply different strains of blue tongue, different variants, right across the country in equal intensity almost. And that's obviously having a drag on production, and probably will get a lot worse given the varying attitudes to vaccination. So this is a very real issue. And just point out that last year it wasn't until July that we really saw the ramp in numbers. It was dormant through Europe. We now know it's widespread, and when we get that warm weather, it might just pick up a little earlier. But this has a massive impact on the sentiment in the market on the production side.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Steve, we've recently heard reported a foot and mouth disease case in Hungary. Now, we did have a single case reported a couple of months back in Germany, which, commentary suggests might have even been a false positive because of vaccinations. But this outbreak in Hungary, is quite different. It's in a large herd, 1,400 dairy cattle herd. I won't try and say the name of the village where the outbreaks occurred, but it's very close to the Slovakian border and not too far from Austria. Now, these aren't big production regions, Steve, but we're already seeing countries, putting import bans on meat and dairy products from the 3 countries. There's been immediate action to contain it, but it's going to be one to watch. Hungary does export a bit of cheese, and those cheese exports might be at a bit of risk, but not a large region, but, certainly an issue to watch over the next couple of weeks and months.
Chart of the week, Joe.
Chart of the week, and we're back over to the US for chart of the week this week, Steve. US export data came out for January. So US exports are up 15% year on year in milk solids equivalent overall, Steve, but it's really cheese that's led the way. You can see in those numbers there. Mexico is sort of growing more slowly, less than 1% up year on year for January, but it's those contested cheese markets, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, where volumes really picked up in January. Skim milk powder and non-fat dry milk down 20%. As you'd expect, this is still the hangover of the very high and uncompetitive prices we saw in the US at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. WPC 80 still surging, mostly into China, but of late, a bit more product into Japan. And coming late to the MPC trend, getting some of that Chinese growth in MPC exports there. So the percentages, as always, Steve, a little bit deceiving. The tonnage is really good to look at, especially with butter, with that very strong price advantage that the US has enjoyed over the last six months, probably. It's not a lot of tonnage involved in that percentage increase. Over the last 3 months, it really just amounts to 3,300 tonne of additional exports of butter. But you can see there, in terms of those tonnages, it really is cheese that's been the big mover in the last 12 months for US exporters. And it will need to be a big mover in the coming 12 months, Steve.
Indeed. Okay, that's a good wrap. That's all from us. We will be back next week, and we'll see you then.